In the sweltering summer of 1944, deep within the fortified bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Oberst Hans Weber stood before a wall-sized map of France and saw only victory. At 47, his uniform still fit the way it had in 1940. His posture still carried the rigid certainty of a man who had never been wrong about war. The red and blue markers on the map told a story he understood intimately. The Normandy beachhead, bleeding the Allies white. Panzer divisions holding the line at Caen. The hedgerow country of the Cotton-Tam Peninsula, swallowing American advances like quicksand. He had written the book on this, literally. The 1941 Tactical Manual on Armored Warfare that every panzer officer carried bore his name on the title page. 23 years of soldiering, from the trenches of Verdun to the triumph of France, distilled into doctrine. Speed is life, he had written, but direction is victory. The Americans had speed. They lacked direction. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood at the head of the table, his fingers drumming against polished wood as Weber concluded his intelligence briefing. The room smelled of coffee and old cigarette smoke, the air thick with the confidence of men who believed they had survived the worst. D-Day had come and gone a month ago. The Atlantic Wall had held long enough. Now it was mathematics, attrition, the grinding calculus of defensive warfare that favored the defender. The American buildup continues, Weber said, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man reporting facts, not fears. Bradley's First Army presses toward St. Lo. Montgomery remains stalled before Caen. Our fuel situation is critical, but manageable. Luftwaffe sorties are limited, but the weather has grounded Allied air superiority for 3 days running. He paused, his pointer touching a spot south of the Cotton-Tam Peninsula. The front is stable, contained. The Americans fight with material superiority, but they lack our understanding of mobile warfare. They advance like a man walking through mud. We wrote the manual on lightning war. They have read it, gentlemen, but reading is not understanding. Scattered nods around the table, a few tight smiles. These were men who had conquered a continent in 6 weeks 4 years ago. The pride never left. It had merely gone dormant, waiting for vindication. Keitel dismissed the briefing with a wave. Weber gathered his papers, feeling the weight of sleepless nights in his shoulders, but not in his certainty. He had been doing this too long to doubt himself now. In the corridor outside, an aide handed him a telegram. Personal correspondence, approved through channels. From Normandy, from his son. Weber carried it to his small office, closed the door, and sat in the pool of lamplight that seemed inadequate against the gathering dusk. Karl's handwriting, neat despite the circumstances, filled half a page. His boy had always been meticulous. 22 years old, commanding a Panzer IV platoon in the 2nd Panzer Division, following in his father's footsteps as sons do, carrying forward the legacy as sons must. The letter spoke of small things, the quality of rations, the mechanical reliability of the tanks, the Americans probing the lines with increasing boldness. Then buried in the middle, a single sentence that Weber read twice. Father, the Americans fight differently than you described in your manual. Their coordination between air and ground is something we never faced in Poland or France. Weber set the telegram down and stared at the map on his wall. His map, his understanding of the battlefield, built over decades, validated by victory after victory until Russia had complicated things. But Russia was the East. The West was where doctrine had been born. The West was where it would be proven again. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began composing his response. The words came easily. They always did when teaching. Remember, he wrote, speed is life, but direction is victory. The Americans have material advantage, but material without doctrine is merely waste. Trust your training. Trust the manual. Trust that we have thought through these problems before they arise. He signed it, sealed it, and placed it in the outgoing correspondence tray. Then he returned to his work, analyzing the day's intelligence reports, searching for patterns in the chaos, finding reassurance in the familiar rhythms of staff work. He did not know he had just written the philosophy that would kill thousands of his students. The days bled together after that, July 10th, 11th, 12th. The weather turned, and with it came the Allied air forces in strength. Yabos, the soldiers called them. Fighter bombers that turned roads into graveyards and daylight movement into suicide. The reports from the front grew grimmer in their details, but not in their conclusions. Casualties mounting, yes. Fuel critically short, yes. But the line held. It always held. That was what defensive positions did when properly employed. On July 15th, Weber received another letter from Karl, shorter this time, more urgent. We are falling back from Pontebert. Americans using artillery in concentrations we have never seen. Father, they are learning, faster than expected. Weber frowned at the words. Learning was not the same as understanding. A child could learn to parrot words without grasping their meaning. The Americans had industrial capacity, numbers, material. But war was not production statistics. War was art and science combined, and art could not be taught from a manual. It had to be lived, absorbed, internalized over years of study and practice. The Americans were improvising. Improvisation could work for a time, but doctrine endured. He wrote back immediately, maintain discipline. Falling back is not defeat if done in good order. Remember the principles, preserve the force, trade space for time, keep the formation intact. These principles won us France in 1940. They will hold France now. On July 20th, the world shifted on its axis, though not in the way Weber had been watching for. The bomb at the Wolf's Lair, the failed assassination attempt, the purges that followed. Weber spent that day and the next in a haze of confusion and fear, watching as names he knew disappeared from duty rosters, arrested or worse. His mentor, General Henning von Treschow, found dead by his own hand on the Eastern Front, rather than face interrogation. The letter arrived 3 days later, forwarded through channels by an aide who had survived the purge. Treschow's final words, written in the hour before he drove out to the front and pulled a grenade to his chest. Weber read it alone. In the small hours after midnight, when even the Wolf's Lair grew quiet. Hans, it began, we failed because we moved too slowly. In all things we have moved too slowly. Too slow to see the regime for what it was. Too slow to act when action might have mattered. Too slow to understand that speed without moral purpose is just efficient murder. You were always the best of us at operational thinking. Apply that now to your own conscience. Remember, the fastest tank in the world is worthless if it is racing toward the wrong objective. Weber burned the letter after reading it 3 times. The ash turned to nothing in the metal wastebasket, but the words remained, lodged somewhere behind his eyes where they itched and ached and would not leave him alone. He tried to bury himself in work, reports, analysis, intelligence summaries. The comfortable rituals of staff duty. But Treschow's words echoed in the spaces between the data. July 24th brought a new development, intelligence intercepts from Normandy, fragmentary and puzzling. References to a Third Army and Allied communications, not Bradley's first, not Patton's. Wait. Weber sat up straighter, his fatigue forgotten. George S. Patton, the American general who had raced across Sicily in 38 days, who had defeated Rommel's best students in North Africa, who had been sidelined after the slapping incidents. Weber pulled the file. It was thin, compartmented, marked with a red stamp. Gefährlich, dangerous. He spread the contents across his desk. Photographs of a man in his late 50s, jaw like a boulder, eyes like ice. Service record stretching back to the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa. Tank Corps in 1918. Between the wars, one of the few American officers who had thought seriously about armored warfare, who had corresponded with Fuller and Little Hart, who had studied Guderian. The psychological profile made for unsettling reading. Subject believes in reincarnation, claims to have fought as a Roman legionnaire, a Napoleonic cavalry officer, a Viking warrior. Approaches warfare as a religious calling, exhibits grandiose self-confidence bordering on delusion. But combat records suggest confidence may be justified. Prefers offensive action to the point of recklessness. Disdains secure flanks. Will take any risk for speed and surprise. Note, subject's methodology mirrors German doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, possibly refined beyond current Wehrmacht implementation. Weber closed the file and stared at the wall. An American who thought like a German, who believed he was a reborn warrior, who fought with the zealotry of faith rather than the calculation of reason. This was not improvement. This was something else, something potentially catastrophic. He reached for the telephone to call von Kluge, then hesitated. What would he say? That an American general who believed in past lives was dangerous because he fought too much like a German? That Weber was worried about facing a mirror image of his own doctrine? It would sound like defeatism. In the current climate, defeatism was lethal. The phone rang before he could decide. The operator connected him to a field exchange, crackling with static and distance. Then Karl's voice, tinny and urgent, coming from somewhere in Normandy where the July heat was surely sweltering and the American artillery was surely falling. Father, Karl, your letter reached me. The situation is understood. Maintain cohesion, fall back in good order. The line will stabilize. A pause, static. Then, Father, they are concentrating forces west of Saint-Lô. Artillery like I have never seen. Trucks bringing ammunition forward all night. We can hear them through the hedgerows. Command has moved us to the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. 2nd Panzer Division is tasked with anchor duty. Anchor duty, holding a critical junction while others withdrew. Prestige assignment or death sentence, depending on how events unfolded. Weber felt his throat tighten. The Americans telegraphed their intentions. Concentrations take time. You will have warning before any assault begins. Remember the manual. Prepared positions, overlapping fields of fire, reserves held for counterattack. I have read the manual, Father. I have it here. But the Americans, Father, I do not think they have read it. They do things that make no tactical sense, and then somehow it works anyway. Tactics that violate doctrine may achieve local success, but they cannot sustain operations. Trust the principles, Karl. I built them from lessons learned in blood across 2 wars. They have held against every test. Another pause. Longer this time. Weber could almost see his son in whatever bunker or farmhouse he was calling from. Dirty and tired and so terribly young, despite the uniform and the responsibility. I trust you, Father. I always have. And I trust you to do your duty, to remember what I taught you, to survive this and come home, and perhaps, God willing, find a different profession in a different time. Karl's laugh, short and bitter beyond his years. What other profession is there for a Weber? We are soldiers. You, grandfather. Great-grandfather. It is what we do. Yes, Weber said, though the word tasted like ash. It is what we do. Stay safe, my son. Follow the doctrine. Keep your head down and come home. I will try, Father. I love you. The line went dead before Weber could respond. He sat holding the telephone receiver, listening to the empty static, until an operator's voice asked if he needed the line. He hung up carefully, his hands steady through long practice, and returned to his work because work was all he had. July 25th dawned clear and bright across Normandy. Weber knew this from the weather reports, filed and analyzed in the sterile environment of the Wolf's Lair, far from the smell of summer grass and the sound of artillery. He was reading the morning intelligence summary when the first reports began arriving from Army Group B. Massive aerial bombardment west of Saint-Lô. Unprecedented scale. Thousands of aircraft. He moved to the map room, where other officers were already gathering, their faces tight with concentration. The situation reports came in fragmentary bursts, each one worse than the last. Panzer Lehr Division, fortified and prepared, had ceased to exist as a cohesive formation. Communications lost. Command posts obliterated. Survivors streaming rearward in shock. Carpet bombing, someone said. Americans are using carpet bombing as battlefield preparation. Weber stared at the map and felt something cold settle into his stomach. This was not tactical air support. This was strategic bombardment brought down to the operational level. This was using a sledgehammer to crack a door already weakened by weeks of attrition. This was, he struggled for the word, this was American. Overwhelming force applied without elegance, without finesse, but with devastating effectiveness. The reports continued through the day. American armor pouring through the gap, infantry following. The exploitation phase beginning before the breakthrough was even confirmed. Weber recognized the pattern because he had written about it, had taught it, had seen it executed in 1940 when France had fallen in 6 weeks. But this was faster, more ruthless. The Americans were not pausing to consolidate. They were not securing flanks. They were simply driving forward, accepting risk, trading security for speed. By evening, the situation map showed a bulge in the German lines west of Saint-Lô. Not a penetration, not yet, but a bulge that was widening, deepening, threatening to become something worse. Von Klug, commanding Army Group B from his headquarters near Paris, issued orders for counterattacks. Panzer reserves to seal the gap, infantry to reinforce the shoulders. Weber worked through the night, coordinating intelligence, updating estimates, trying to build a coherent picture from the chaos. At 0300 hours, exhausted and hollow-eyed, he returned to his office and found a telegram waiting. From 2nd Panzer Division headquarters, official correspondence. Lieutenant Karl Weber, commanding 3rd Platoon, 5th Company, reported wounded in action July 25th during aerial bombardment. Condition stable. Evacuated to field hospital at Coutances. Unit combat effectiveness reduced 30%. Remaining elements repositioning to secondary defensive line per orders. Weber read it 3 times before the words penetrated. Wounded, stable, evacuated, not dead, not missing. Wounded but alive, and alive was everything. He sat down heavily, feeling the adrenaline drain from his body, leaving only the exhaustion. His son had survived the carpet bombing. His son was in a hospital somewhere, safe for the moment, removed from the immediate fighting. He should have felt relief. He felt only a sick certainty that this was merely postponement. The next 3 days passed in a blur of sleepless hours and worsening reports. July 26th. Americans advancing beyond Saint-Lô. July 27th. Coutances threatened. July 28th. Coutances fallen. And with it the field hospital where Karl was supposed to be recovering. Weber sent frantic queries through channels, receiving only silence or confusion in return. The command structure was breaking down under the speed of the American advance. Formations lost contact. Supply lines severed. The careful architecture of military bureaucracy, so efficient in static positions, collapsing under the strain of fluid warfare. On July 29th, he received a letter. Not a telegram. A letter dated July 26th, written in Karl's neat handwriting on paper, torn from a medical chart. Father, the bombing was apocalypse. I do not have words for what it was like. We were dug in, prepared, confident in our positions. Then the world became fire and noise and earth moving like liquid. I woke in a crater, half buried, both eardrums blown. They tell me I will hear again, eventually. Shrapnel in my left leg, not serious. I am told I am lucky. I am told many things. Father, I want to tell you something true. When the bombing stopped and I climbed from that hole, I saw what was left of my platoon. Good men, trained men. Men who followed the manual exactly as written. They followed it into graves. The manual does not have a chapter on what to do when the sky falls. The manual assumes the enemy fights according to recognizable patterns. I am being evacuated west toward Coutances. They say the hospital there is safe for now. I do not believe them. Nothing is safe. The Americans do not pause. They do not consolidate. They simply come forward like tide, and we fall back, like sand. I do not blame you, Father. You wrote what you knew. You taught what you believed. But I think perhaps war has changed, and we have not changed with it. Or perhaps it has always been this way, and we were just lucky enough to face enemies who followed the same rules we did. I will try to come home, but if I do not, please know that I was proud to be your son. I was proud to serve. I just wish the service had been in a cause worth the cost. Your son, Karl. Weber read it until the words blurred. Then he read it again. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, next to his heart, where it would stay. On July 30th, Avranches fell. The gateway to Brittany, the gateway to the open plains beyond, the gateway to everywhere. The exploitation phase was no longer theoretical. It was happening, and it was happening faster than any operational plan accounted for. Weber stood in the map room and watched the markers being moved. Red for German positions, blue for American forces. The blue markers were advancing in a pattern he recognized from his own studies. Multiple axes, armored spearheads, infantry following to secure ground. This was not American methodology. This was German doctrine, executed with American resources. "Who is commanding their exploitation forces?" he asked. An intelligence officer checked his reports. "Third Army, sir. Activated August 1st. Commander, Lieutenant General George S. Patton." Weber closed his eyes. When he opened them, the map had not changed. Patton, the madman who believed in reincarnation, the general who fought like he was already dead and thus had nothing to fear. The American who had studied German methods and apparently understood them better than the Germans themselves. "I need casualty reports from 2nd Panzer Division," Weber said quietly. "Sir, 2nd Panzer is currently out of contact. Last reported position was—" "I know their last reported position. I need casualty reports. Specifically, I need the status of the field hospital at Coutances." The intelligence officer's face went carefully blank. "Sir, Coutances was overrun on the 28th. American mechanized units bypassed the town initially, then infantry secured it. We have fragmentary reports of prisoners taken, including wounded from several field hospitals. No detailed lists yet. Prisoner." The word hit like a physical blow. His son, if he had been there, if he had been unable to evacuate in time, would now be in American hands. Wounded, deaf, alone, or dead. Dead was also possible, probable even. Men died in overrun hospitals. Bombing did not discriminate between combatants and casualties. Weber thanked the officer and walked from the room with the careful precision of a man who knew that if he moved too quickly, he would shatter. In his office, he pulled out Patton's file again and read it with new eyes, not as an intelligence estimate, as an obituary for everything he had believed. This man, this American who claimed to remember past lives, was systematically demolishing the defensive line that Weber's doctrine said should hold. And he was doing it not through overwhelming force alone, but through operational artistry that would have made Guderian proud. The doctrine was wrong, or the execution was flawed, or the fundamental assumptions about American capabilities were catastrophically incorrect. Or, and this was the thought that Weber could not escape, he had spent 23 years teaching a generation of officers how to wage war at speed. And now an American who had never sat in his classroom was teaching him that speed alone was not enough. That speed without the courage to risk everything was just maneuver. That doctrine without adaptation was dogma. And dogma killed sons. He sat in the darkness of his office, listening to the sound of boots in corridors, voices raised in conference rooms, the machinery of military bureaucracy grinding on, regardless of tactical reality. Somewhere out there in the night, across hundreds of miles of French countryside, his son was wounded or captured or dead. And here, in this bunker, in this map room, in this comfortable delusion of control, Weber finally understood what Tresckow had meant. The fastest tank in the world is worthless if it is racing toward the wrong objective. They had been racing toward this moment for years, building doctrine, training soldiers, perfecting the art of mobile warfare, and they had forgotten to ask the essential question: mobile warfare toward what end? Victory? They were not winning. Survival? They were dying in increments. Honor? There was no honor in what he suddenly saw with terrible clarity was a losing war waged for an evil cause by good men who should have known better. Karl had known. Karl, at 22, had seen what his father at 47 had been too proud to acknowledge. The Americans were not learning. They were not improvising. They were simply fighting the war that actually existed rather than the war the manual described. And the war that existed was one where speed meant accepting risk, where direction meant adaptation, where victory belonged to whoever could think faster than their doctrine. On August 1st, official confirmation came. Third Army activated, Patton in command, 12 divisions, including 4 armored, already deep into Brittany, racing toward Brest and Saint-Malo, already turning east toward the Seine, already moving at speeds that defied logistics, defied caution, defied everything that Weber's 23 years of experience said was possible. Weber requested a meeting with von Kluge. It was granted for August 3rd. He spent 2 days preparing his presentation, marshaling facts, building arguments, constructing the case that the entire defensive strategy in the West needed immediate revision. They needed to trade space for time, fall back to prepared positions on rivers, conserve forces for mobile defense rather than fixed points. They needed to fight the war Patton was waging rather than the war they wished he was waging. On August 3rd, he stood in von Kluge's headquarters outside Paris and presented his analysis. Maps, charts, intelligence summaries. The pattern of Patton's advance. The implications for the strategic position. The recommendation for immediate, large-scale withdrawal before the encirclement completed. Von Kluge listened in silence. When Weber finished, the field marshal stood and walked to the map. He studied it for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Your analysis is excellent, Oberst Weber. Your recommendations are sound, and they are impossible. Sir, if we do not, the Führer has forbidden retreat, forbidden even the discussion of retreat. You were at the briefings after July 20th. You saw what happens to officers who counsel withdrawal. I understand your concern. I share it. But we are not here to make strategy. We are here to execute orders. And the orders are to hold every meter of ground. The orders will kill us? Yes, probably. But soldiers follow orders, Oberst. Even suicidal ones. Especially suicidal ones. That is what makes us soldiers rather than merely armed men. And my son? Your son? All our sons?" Von Kluge's face softened for just a moment. "You have a son in Normandy? 2nd Panzer Division, wounded July 25th, missing as of July 28th, likely captured or dead." The field marshal nodded slowly. "I am sorry, truly. But your son's fate does not change the operational picture, nor does mine. We are not fighting to win anymore, Oberst. We are fighting to avoid losing for as long as possible, to give the fatherland time. For what, I do not know. Miracle weapons? Political settlement? Divine intervention? But that is the mission. Hold the line. Bleed the Americans. Make them pay for every kilometer. That is all we can do." Weber saluted and left. In the corridor outside, he stopped and leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of his uniform, his rank, his entire career pressing down on him. He had taught a generation how to wage war, and now he watched that generation die implementing doctrine that no longer matched reality, following orders that guaranteed destruction, maintaining discipline while racing toward catastrophe. That evening, he returned to the Wolf's Lair and found a telegram waiting. American Red Cross, forwarded through neutral Switzerland, transmitted through military channels. Lieutenant Karl Weber, German Army, identified among wounded prisoners of war captured at Coutances, July 28, 1944. Condition reported as stable. Currently held at POW facility, pending transfer to permanent camp. Personal effects and one letter enclosed for next of kin. Weber's hands shook as he opened the enclosed envelope. Karl's handwriting, shakier than before, dated July 28th. "Father, they found me when they took the hospital. American medics. They were kind. I did not expect kindness. One of them spoke German, from Milwaukee, he said. He told me I would be okay. He told me the war was ending and I would go home. I think he is right, Father. Not about going home. About the war ending. I have seen our positions. I have seen their advance. They are doing to us what we did to France in 1940, except faster, better. We wrote the manual, but they perfected it. I am not angry. I am too tired to be angry. I am just relieved to still be breathing. The Americans feed us. They give us medical care. They treat us like human beings who happen to be on the wrong side, rather than enemies who deserve death. Father, you asked me once to trust the doctrine. I did. It failed. Or we failed it. Or perhaps doctrine itself is the failure, because it cannot account for the human element, the chaos, the randomness that turns battles. But I want you to know something. When that bomb fell and buried me, when I thought I was dying, I did not think about duty or honor or the fatherland. I thought about you, about making you proud, about being worthy of your name. I hope I was. I hope I am. Even now as a prisoner, as a soldier who lost. I hope somewhere in this you can still be proud that I was your son. I love you. Survive this. Learn from this. Be better than the doctrine. Be human, Karl. Weber read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it next to the other one, against his heart, where the weight of them both felt like responsibility, like guilt, like love. On August 7th, Hitler ordered Operation Ludick, a counterattack toward Mortain, designed to cut off Patton's spearheads, to restore the front, to prove that German armor could still achieve decisive results. Weber studied the operational plan and saw only mathematics. 8 panzer divisions, weakened and low on fuel, attacking into prepared American positions with total air superiority overhead. This was not doctrine. This was desperation wearing doctrine's uniform. He was not asked for his opinion. He provided intelligence support, coordinated reconnaissance, did his duty. He did not voice his certainty that this would fail catastrophically. Soldiers followed orders, even suicidal ones. The attack went in at dawn, August 7th. By noon, it was effectively over. American air power shredded the panzer columns. Anti-tank defenses channeled survivors into killing zones. By evening, hundreds of tanks lay burning or abandoned, their crews dead or captured or fleeing east on foot. Weber sat at his desk and stared at the casualty reports and understood with perfect, horrible clarity that he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Not the tactical defeats, the moral ones. He had taught excellence in a bad cause. He had trained competence in service of catastrophe. He had written manuals that turned good men into efficient components of a losing machine. And his son was alive because he had failed, because he had been captured, because he had been removed from the system that Weber had spent decades perfecting. The failure had saved him. The success had killed thousands of others. On August 10th, the maps showed Patton's army across half of France, from Normandy to the Loire in 11 days, another 300 miles, and they would be at the German border. The Falaise pocket was forming, Canadian and American forces closing in from north and south, trapping the remnants of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a closing vice. Weber studied the map and saw his entire career reflected in those red markers surrounded by blue. Doctrine without adaptation, excellence without wisdom, speed toward the wrong objective. Somewhere in America, his son was in a POW camp, deaf and wounded but alive, learning English, reading books, waiting for a war to end that had already ended in every way that mattered. And here in the Wolf's Lair, Hans Weber finally learned the lesson that Patton had been teaching for 14 days. That war was not about doctrine or excellence or the perfection of method. War was about the courage to adapt, the humility to learn, and the wisdom to know when everything you believed was wrong. He had taught his son to follow the manual. An American who believed in reincarnation had taught his son something better, that survival required the courage to break the rules when the rules were killing you. And Weber, sitting alone in his office as the sounds of another briefing echoed from down the hall, understood that he had been wrong about everything. For 23 years he had been wrong, expertly, precisely, fatally wrong. The map on his wall showed Patton's arrows driving deeper into France. The letters against his heart showed his son alive because he had failed to follow those arrows to their conclusion. And Oberst Hans Weber, architect of doctrine, teacher of warfare, father of a POW, sat in the darkness and wondered what the point of expertise was when it led only to catastrophe, what the value of doctrine was when it killed everyone who followed it, what it meant to be a professional soldier when professionalism itself had become the problem. He did not have answers, only questions that tasted like ash. And outside, in the war rooms and corridors of the Wolf's Lair, the machinery of military bureaucracy ground on, sending orders to divisions that no longer existed, planning counterattacks with forces that had already been destroyed, following doctrine all the way down into darkness. While across France, George S. Patton raced toward legend, and Hans Weber raced toward understanding that he had spent his entire life preparing soldiers to lose beautifully, efficiently, and in perfect accordance with rules that no longer mattered to anyone except the dead. The morning of August 10th broke over East Prussia with the kind of cruel brightness that made maps easier to read and losses harder to ignore. Weber stood in the Situation Room at 0600 hours, watching junior officers update the operational map with markers that told a story he no longer wanted to understand. Blue arrows reaching from Normandy to the Loire River in 12 days. Red circles surrounded by blue indicating German forces trapped in pockets that were closing like fists. The numbers came in through radio reports, telephone calls, dispatch riders who arrived mud-spattered and hollow-eyed from the west. Patton's Third Army had liberated Nantes, Angers, Le Mans. Cities that should have required days or weeks of fighting fell in hours, not because the defenses were weak, but because there were no longer any defenses. Just scattered units falling back faster than commands could reach them, supply columns abandoned for lack of fuel, communication networks fragmenting under the speed of collapse. Weber had requested and received permission to remain in the intelligence section rather than take a field command. He told his superiors it was because his expertise was needed for analysis, for understanding the pattern of Allied operations, for providing strategic insight. The truth was simpler and more cowardly. He could not lead men into battles he knew were unwinnable, while his own son sat in an American prison camp, safe from the doctrine Weber had written. An aide approached with a folder marked urgent. Weber took it without comment, opened it, and felt the remaining foundation of his professional pride crack and settle. Intercepted supply manifest from captured American logistics units. The data confirmed what he had begun to suspect 3 days ago. Patton's divisions were being supplied, in part by captured German fuel dumps. Tens of thousands of gallons. The armor racing toward the Seine was running on Wehrmacht petroleum, taken from depots that were supposed to supply the panzers, now trapped in Normandy. "We are powering our own destruction," Weber said quietly. The aide, a young lieutenant with a fresh face and old eyes, nodded. "Yes, sir. Intelligence suggests that American advance units prioritize fuel depots as targets. They are not destroying them. They are capturing them intact and immediately redistributing the contents to their own vehicles." Weber closed the folder. "Of course they are. It is what I would do. It is what the manual recommends. Exploit enemy logistics. Turn their preparation against them. Basic doctrine. We taught them this by example in Poland and France. They learned the lesson. Sir, if they are using our fuel, does that not suggest their own supply lines are overstretched, perhaps vulnerable to counterattack? Perhaps, if we had fuel to mount counterattacks, if we had air cover to protect advancing columns, if we had mobility, surprise, and initiative. But we have none of those things. They have all of them, plus our gasoline. Do you know what that is called, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. Operational irony. The kind that gets men killed while staff officers write reports about lessons learned." The young officer retreated. Weber returned his attention to the map, searching for patterns that might suggest opportunity, finding only confirmation of catastrophe. The Falaise pocket was now clearly visible on the map. 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, roughly 100,000 men, trapped in a salient between Canadian forces pushing south from Caen and American forces driving north from Argentan. The gap between the pincers measured perhaps 15 kilometers, narrowing daily. Soon it would be 10 kilometers, then 5, then 1. And Patton's spearheads were already past the pocket, racing east toward the Seine, leaving the encirclement to be completed by other units while he chased the strategic objective. This was not American methodology. Americans were supposed to be cautious, methodical, concerned with secure flanks and protected supply lines. This was German doctrine executed with American logistics. This was what happened when doctrine met resources, met audacity. Weber had taught audacity for 20 years. Now it was killing his students. A commotion at the door. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, entered with an entourage of staff officers and map cases. The room snapped to attention. Jodl waved them to ease with the impatient gesture of a man who had more urgent concerns than military courtesy. "Gentlemen, the Führer has requested a detailed assessment of American operational capabilities, with particular focus on Third Army's advance. Oberst Weber, you have been tracking this situation most closely. Brief me. 5 minutes, no political considerations, just tactical reality." Weber stepped to the map, pointer in hand, and felt the weight of truth about to be spoken in a room where truth had become increasingly dangerous. "Sir, Third Army under Patton has advanced approximately 250 miles in 12 days. Their rate of advance exceeds our own performance in the 1940 campaign. They are achieving this through several factors. He touched the pointer to the markers representing Patton's divisions. First, operational tempo. They do not pause to consolidate gains. Spearheads bypass strong points, leaving them for follow-up infantry. This is textbook exploitation doctrine, but executed with unprecedented aggression. Second, logistics. They have solved the fuel problem through a combination of pre-positioned supplies, aerial resupply, and captured German stocks. Third, air superiority. Our ability to move by day is effectively zero. Theirs is unlimited. Fourth, and most critically, command philosophy. Jodel's eyes narrowed. Explain, sir. Patton operates on a principle of mission-type orders taken to an extreme. He gives subordinates objectives and timelines, then allows them complete freedom of execution. The result is that local commanders exploit opportunities without waiting for permission. The decision cycle is faster than our ability to respond. By the time we identify a threat and issue orders to counter it, the situation has already changed. You are describing German doctrine. Yes, sir. I am describing our doctrine, perfected. Patton appears to have studied our methods and removed the elements that slowed us down. Caution about flanks, concern for supply security, obedience to higher orders that limit initiative. He has weaponized our own tactical philosophy and added American material superiority. Jodl studied the map in silence. The room waited. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Your assessment is that we are facing an enemy who has learned our methods and improved upon them? Yes, sir. And your recommendation? This was the moment. Weber could feel the attention of the room focused on him, could sense the danger in any answer that suggested defeat was inevitable, could calculate the risk to his career and possibly his life. He thought of Trescow's letter, of Karl's capture, of 23 years spent teaching doctrine that was now being used to destroy everything he had built. Sir, my recommendation is immediate, large-scale withdrawal to prepare defensive positions on the Seine and some rivers. Trade space for time. Preserve forces for mobile defense rather than fixed positions. Accept the loss of France to prevent the loss of the entire Western Army. The silence that followed was absolute. Weber could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the sweat beginning to form under his collar despite the cool morning air. Jodel's face remained expressionless, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation, consideration, or perhaps simply the recognition of a man who had said too much truth. Your recommendation is noted, Oberst Weber. It is also impossible. The Führer has made his strategic intent clear. We hold. We counterattack. We make the Americans pay for every meter. Those are our orders. We will execute them. Jodl turned to the assembled staff. Continue current operations. Prepare detailed analyses of enemy supply vulnerabilities. I want options for interdiction strikes by what remains of the Luftwaffe. Dismissed. The room emptied. Weber remained staring at the map until only Jodl and one aide remained. The General Oberst approached, his voice low enough that only Weber could hear. Your analysis was correct. Your recommendation was correct. And if you repeat either in front of anyone else, you will be arrested for defeatism and likely shot. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. Now forget I said that and continue your work. We need accurate intelligence even if we cannot act on it, especially if we cannot act on it. Someone needs to document how this happened so that perhaps, someday, someone can learn from it. Jodl left. Weber stood alone in the Situation Room, surrounded by maps that showed disaster unfolding in real time, and understood that he had just been given permission to witness the end of everything he had worked for, not to prevent it, just to watch it happen and write the reports that no one would read until after the war was lost. He returned to his office and found a letter waiting, from the American Red Cross, updating Karl's status. Transferred to a permanent POW camp in England. Health improving. Hearing partially restored in right ear. Allowed to send and receive limited correspondence. Weber read this twice, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. His son was alive. Healing. Beyond the reach of doctrine and operational philosophy and the collapse of the Western Front, He placed the notification with the two letters already against his heart. 3 pieces now of his son's survival. 3 reminders that the greatest failure of Weber's career, his inability to keep Karl safe, to keep him from being captured, had also been the greatest success, because capture had meant survival. August 12th brought the first photographs. Reconnaissance flights, increasingly rare and desperately dangerous, had managed to capture images of the Falaise pocket from high altitude. Weber studied them through a magnifying glass, seeing details that transformed statistics into horror. Roads jammed with vehicles nose to tail, artillery craters overlapping, destroyed tanks and trucks and horses and wagons, creating obstacles that trapped survivors in killing zones. This was not combat. This was slaughter captured from above with clinical precision. He thought of the American who would see these same images and feel satisfaction. Patton, somewhere ahead of the pocket, racing toward the Seine. Montgomery, methodically tightening the noose from the north. Bradley, coordinating the encirclement from his headquarters. Professional soldiers doing their jobs professionally, destroying an enemy who had once seemed invincible and now simply seemed trapped. A telegram arrived that afternoon. Karl's handwriting passed through Red Cross channels, censored in places, but still readable. Father, I am in England now, a place called Yorkshire. The camp is cold but adequate. They feed us, give us blankets, allow us to write letters and receive packages. I have been assigned to a work detail repairing farm equipment. It is peaceful work, useful work, work that fixes things rather than destroys them. I spoke with an American officer yesterday. He had fought in Normandy, lost men to German artillery. He should have hated me, I think. But instead, he asked about my education, my family, my hopes after the war. When I told him my father was a career officer, he nodded and said, "Professional soldiers on both sides, fighting for politicians who will outlive us all." I think he understood something about this war that I am only beginning to grasp. Father, I hope you are well. I hope you are safe. I hope when this ends, we can both find something better than doctrine to believe in. Perhaps simply the belief that sons should bury fathers, not the reverse. That would be doctrine enough. Your son, Karl. Weber folded the letter and added it to the growing collection against his heart. 4 letters now, each one a reminder that survival sometimes required failure, that the greatest victory might be simply living long enough to learn from defeat. August 14th. The Falaise Gap now measured 8 kilometers. Von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, disappeared for 12 hours. Search parties dispatched, rumors circulated, suicide, defection, capture. Weber knew the truth was probably simpler and more tragic. A commander overwhelmed by responsibility, by impossible orders, by the gap between what was being demanded and what was achievable. When von Kluge finally returned, his explanation was vague. Lost communications, separated from staff, avoiding air attacks. Weber suspected the field marshal had simply driven into the countryside and sat in his car, staring at fields and forests and trying to find courage either to end his life or continue a war that was already lost. In the end, von Kluge chose continuation because soldiers chose continuation, because that was what doctrine and training and a lifetime of service demanded. 2 weeks later, he would choose differently, taking cyanide rather than face arrest for alleged involvement in the July bomb plot. But on August 14th, he chose to continue, and so the dying continued. August 15th brought the crisis point. The gap was now 6 kilometers. Canadian and American forces could see each other across the narrowing corridor. German units were attempting breakout, fighting toward the gap with desperate fury. Some made it through, abandoning equipment, carrying only weapons and what they could carry. Others were caught in the killing zone, destroyed by artillery and air attacks that turned the gap into an abattoir. Weber received a field telephone call at 1400 hours. The voice on the other end was hoarse, exhausted, speaking over the sound of explosions and small arms fire. "Oberst Weber, this is Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt, 3rd Battalion, 12th SS Panzer Division. I was in your 1939 class at the War Academy. Do you remember me?" Weber pulled the name from memory. Youngest officer in the class. Brilliant tactical mind. Family from Munich. Wanted to be an architect before the war. I remember, Hauptmann. What is your situation? We are in the pocket, sir. Attempting breakout tonight. Perhaps 200 men left from a battalion that went into Normandy, with 800. I am calling because I wanted you to know that we followed the doctrine. Everything you taught us. Speed, maneuver, initiative. It was not enough. The enemy has our doctrine, plus resources we cannot match. They fight like we taught them to fight. Only better. Static on the line. The sound of someone shouting orders. Then Schmidt's voice again, strained. Sir, I am not calling to complain or to blame. I am calling because I want you to know that what you taught us was correct. The problem was not the doctrine. The problem was the cause. Good tactics in service of bad strategy is still bad strategy. And we are dying now because we were too well trained to question whether the strategy was worth dying for. Hauptmann, save your men. Get them through the gap. Survive this. I will try, sir, but I needed you to know. The doctrine was sound. The war was wrong. Those of us who survive need to remember that distinction. We need to teach that distinction, so that the next generation does not confuse tactical excellence with moral correctness. The line went dead. Weber never learned if Schmidt made it through the gap. The name never appeared on casualty lists or POW rosters. Sometimes absence was its own answer. That evening, Weber worked late in his office, compiling reports that no one would read, documenting failures that everyone could see. He was interrupted by a knock. Unusual at this hour. He called entry. The door opened to reveal Field Marshal Model, newly arrived to command Army Group B after von Klug's removal. Model was a different kind of officer than von Klug. Shorter, more intense, defensive specialist, known for stabilizing collapsing fronts through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. He entered without ceremony, closed the door, and sat without invitation. Oberst Weber, I have read your intelligence summaries. Excellent work. Clear-eyed analysis, pessimistic but accurate. I need you to brief me personally on Patton's operational patterns. Everything you know. Nothing held back. Weber pulled his files and began. He spoke for 90 minutes covering Patton's Sicily campaign, North Africa, the current advance through France, movement patterns, command philosophy, risk tolerance, likely next objectives. Model listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his face revealing nothing. When Weber finished, Model stood and walked to the map. So, we are facing a German general in American uniform, a man who has studied our methods and stripped away the elements that slowed us. Caution, careful logistics, obedience to higher authority when that authority is wrong. He is us, perfected. Yes, sir, that is my assessment. And your recommendation? Mobile defense, sir. Trade space for time. Fall back to the Seine, then the Somme, then the Siegfried Line. Make them pay for every river crossing, but do not try to hold ground that cannot be held. Preserve the army rather than sacrifice it for temporary delays. Model turned from the map. A year ago, that would have been the correct answer. Now, the Führer will not permit retreat. He has made that abundantly clear. So we adapt. We fight the battle we are allowed to fight rather than the battle we wish to fight. We hold where we can, withdraw where we must, and die where necessary. That is our mission. Can you work within those constraints? Weber thought of Karl, safe in England, of 21 dead students, of Schmidt's phone call from the collapsing pocket. He thought of 2 decades spent teaching excellence in service of catastrophe. Yes, sir, I can work within those constraints, but I cannot promise success, only professional execution of impossible orders. That is all any of us can promise now, Oberst. Professional execution of impossible orders. It is what we are trained for, what we excel at, perhaps the last thing we excel at. Model moved toward the door, then paused. Your son is a prisoner? Yes, sir. Captured at Coutances, now in England. Then he is out. He survived. That is more than most will achieve. Model's hand was on the doorknob. I have 3 sons in uniform, Oberst. 1 in Italy, 1 in the East, 1 with the Luftwaffe. I would trade every victory I have ever achieved for their survival. But that is not a choice soldiers get to make. We fight the wars we are given, not the wars we wish for. Your son was lucky, Take comfort in that. Model left. Weber sat alone in his office, staring at maps that showed blue arrows advancing and red circles shrinking, and understood that he was being asked to do the thing he had trained for his entire career. Execute hopeless operations with professional competence, maintain discipline in the face of defeat, and document everything so that someone, someday, might learn from how Germany's best tactical minds had been destroyed by strategic stupidity and ideological blindness. He could do that. He was trained for it. But the question that haunted him as he worked through the night was simpler and more corrosive. What was the point of professional excellence when the profession itself had become corrupted? What did it mean to be a good soldier in a bad war? And how did a man live with the knowledge that his expertise had been weaponized against the very people he had trained to trust him? August 17th, the Falaise Gap closed. Canadian and American forces linked up at Chambois. Approximately 50,000 Germans trapped, 10,000 killed in the final bombardment, 40,000 captured. Perhaps 20,000 had escaped through the narrowing corridor in the previous days, abandoning all heavy equipment, retreating on foot or in whatever vehicle still had fuel. The photographs from that day would haunt Weber for the rest of his life. Thousands of dead horses, killed by bombing. Destroyed vehicles creating barriers that trapped men in the killing zone. Prisoners, hollow-eyed and defeated, being marched to temporary camps. The flower of the Panzer Force, the divisions that had conquered France in 1940, reduced to scattered survivors and corpse-strewn fields. And beyond the pocket, Patton's spearheads were already at the Seine, already crossing in some places, already racing toward Metz, Nancy, the German border. The pursuit was not ending, it was accelerating. The destruction of Army Group B had not slowed the American advance. It had merely removed the last obstacle between Patton and the Rhine. Weber compiled his reports. Casualties, catastrophic. Equipment losses, total. Strategic situation, untenable. Recommendation, none. There were no recommendations that would be followed, no analysis that would change decisions made at levels where tactical reality was subordinate to political necessity. He worked mechanically, filing reports, updating estimates, briefing staff officers who nodded and thanked him, and then issued orders that ignored everything he had said. The machinery of military bureaucracy ground forward regardless of reality, propelled by inertia and doctrine, and the inability to imagine any alternative to continuation. On August 19th, Paris rose in revolt, resistance fighters taking to the streets, barricades rising, the German garrison, small and isolated, attempting to maintain control of a city that no longer feared occupation. Von Choltitz, commanding the garrison, faced orders to destroy the city rather than surrender it intact. He would ultimately disobey those orders. But on August 19th, the outcome remained uncertain, and Weber watched reports come in of fighting in the streets, of French civilians dying for liberation, of the symbolic capital of occupied Europe slipping from German control. Patton's forces were southeast of the city, held back on orders to allow free French forces the honor of liberation. This was politics, strategic theater, a gift to French pride and Allied unity. But it also meant that Patton's divisions were now within striking distance of Paris, having crossed France from Normandy to the capital in exactly 17 days. Weber did the mathematics. In 1940, the Wehrmacht had covered the same distance in 6 weeks. Patton had done it in less than 3. The student had not merely learned the lessons, he had perfected them, improved them, and used them to destroy the teachers. That evening, Weber wrote a letter he knew he could not send, to Karl in England, to the son who had survived by being captured, who was safe because he had failed to follow doctrine to its conclusion. My son, I have spent these weeks watching the army I helped build be destroyed by methods I helped perfect. I taught a generation of officers how to wage mobile warfare, how to exploit breakthrough, how to race forward without pause. Now an American general is using those methods to annihilate the Wehrmacht in France, and I can only watch and document and understand, finally, what you learned in that crater under the bombs. The doctrine was correct in its technical details, but doctrine without wisdom is just murder with footnotes. And I spent 23 years teaching footnotes while forgetting to teach wisdom. Or perhaps I could not teach wisdom because I lacked it myself. because I confused tactical excellence with strategic correctness, because I believed that if we fought well enough for long enough, the cause would prove itself just by our sacrifice. You are alive because you stopped following the doctrine, because you surrendered, because you chose survival over obedience. I am only now beginning to understand that this was not failure. This was wisdom that I never managed to teach, but that you learned anyway, probably despite me rather than because of me. When this war ends, and it will end, with our defeat, that much is now clear. I hope we can both find a different doctrine to follow. Perhaps simply the doctrine of being human rather than being soldiers. Perhaps that would be enough. Your father, Hans. He burned the letter after writing it. It could not be sent through official channels. It contained thoughts that would be considered treasonous if discovered. But writing it had served its purpose, had forced him to articulate what he had been thinking for weeks, to acknowledge that the entire edifice of his professional life had been built on foundations that were now revealed as sand. August 20th brought word that Paris had fallen to Free French forces with American support, de Gaulle entering the city in triumph, the German garrisons surrendering after token resistance, von Choltitz choosing preservation over destruction, disobeying Hitler's orders, saving the city, and undoubtedly signing his own death warrant if he survived to face military justice. Weber studied the reports and recognized a pattern. Officers at every level were beginning to make decisions based on reality rather than orders. Withdrawing when ordered to stand, surrendering when ordered to fight, preserving men when ordered to sacrifice them. The command structure was not so much breaking as quietly deciding that orders from Berlin no longer reflected anything resembling achievable military objectives. This was how armies died. Not with glorious last stands, but with 1,000 small decisions to prioritize survival over obedience, to choose tactical sense over strategic fantasy. The Wehrmacht was still fighting, but it was fighting with increasing desperation and decreasing belief that any of it mattered. On August 22nd, Weber received one final communication from Karl, shorter than the others, written on Red Cross stationery and pencil because pens were not allowed to prisoners. Father, I have heard from other prisoners about what is happening in France, about the pocket at Falaise, about Paris falling, about our army retreating across the Seine. I am glad I am not there. I know that is cowardice by the definition we both lived under, but I have decided that surviving this war is more important than dying well in it. I hope you can forgive me for that. I hope you can forgive yourself for teaching me to be a good soldier when what I needed was to be taught how to be a good man who happened to serve. Your son, Karl. Weber read the letter once, then placed it with the others against his heart. 5 letters now. Each one a piece of his son's survival. Each one a reminder that the greatest failure of Weber's career, his inability to keep Karl safe, to keep him from being captured, had also been the greatest success because capture had meant survival. The weight of the letters pressed against his chest throughout the day as he briefed staff, analyzed reports, and documented the ongoing collapse of Army Group B. The weight was physical, tangible, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond the maps and the markers and the casualty figures, there were actual human beings whose lives were being destroyed by decisions made in rooms like this by men like him. By evening August 22nd, the situation map showed Patton's forces across the Seine at multiple points. Mantes, Vernon, Melun. The pursuit was continuing. The exploitation was ongoing. There would be no pause, no rest, no opportunity for the Wehrmacht to reconstitute defenses. Patton was racing toward the German border, and nothing Weber could analyze or recommend or document would slow him down. Because the truth that Weber had finally accepted was simple and terrible. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to delay, to buy time for a fatherland that could not be saved by time alone, to maintain discipline and professional standards while executing orders that guaranteed destruction, to die well rather than to live poorly. And Weber, sitting in his office in the Wolf's Lair, surrounded by maps and reports and the accumulated wisdom of 23 years of military service, finally understood that he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment of uselessness. All his expertise, all his tactical brilliance, all his understanding of operational warfare, none of it mattered when the strategic situation was hopeless, The cause was lost, and the only remaining question was how many more sons would die before their fathers admitted defeat. He thought of Patton, somewhere ahead in France, racing forward with the confidence of a man who believed he was destiny incarnate, racing forward using doctrine that Weber had helped write, racing forward to destroy an enemy that had created the methods of its own destruction. And Weber understood finally what Tresco had meant about speed. Not tactical speed, moral speed, the speed to recognize when you were wrong, the speed to change course before you killed everyone who trusted you, the speed to say no when obedience meant catastrophe. They had moved too slowly, all of them. For years they had moved too slowly to recognize what they were serving, what they were fighting for, what they were dying to preserve. And now, watching Patton race across France in a fraction of the time it had taken the Wehrmacht in 1940, Weber understood that they were not just losing a military campaign, they were losing a moral reckoning. Being taught by history itself that speed without purpose was just exhaustion, that doctrine without ethics was just sophisticated murder, that professionalism in service of evil was still evil. The letters against his heart seemed heavier. 5 pieces of paper, 5 pieces of his son's survival, 5 reminders that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier could do was stop being a soldier. Weber turned off the light in his office and sat in darkness, listening to the sounds of the wolf's lair continuing around him. Boots in corridors, voices in conference rooms, the machinery of a military that was still functioning despite having already lost. And somewhere in England, his son was alive, learning to be a prisoner, learning to be something other than a soldier, learning perhaps to be the man that Weber had failed to teach him to be because Weber himself had never learned the lesson. In the darkness, Weber made a decision. When this war ended, when, not if, he would find his son, he would apologize, not for the doctrine or the tactics or the professional training, but for confusing excellence with righteousness, for teaching Karl how to fight without teaching him what was worth fighting for being a perfect soldier in service of an imperfect cause. It would not fix anything. It would not bring back the dead students or the destroyed divisions or the years of wasted brilliance, but it would be honest. And honesty, Weber was beginning to understand, was the only doctrine that actually mattered. The doctrine of admitting when you were wrong, the doctrine of surviving to learn from failure, the doctrine of being human first and soldier second. Outside his window, the East Prussian night was dark and quiet. In France, Patton was racing toward the German border, carrying doctrine forward like a sword. And in the wolf's lair, Hans Weber sat in darkness and wondered if wisdom always came too late, or if perhaps late wisdom was better than none at all. The letters against his heart had no answer. They were just paper and ink and a son's survival. But on this night, in this darkness, in this moment of recognition, that seemed like enough. Tomorrow the war would continue. The reports would need updating. The maps would need revising. The machinery of professional military service would grind forward regardless of doubt or recognition or moral clarity. But tonight, for just a few hours, Weber allowed himself to sit in darkness and understand that he had been wrong about everything except the thing that mattered most, that sons should survive their father's mistakes, and Karl would. Karl was alive, and that made every other failure bearable. Barely, but bearable. The darkness gave no comfort, but it gave truth. And sometimes truth was all a man could carry forward into whatever came next. August 23, 1944. Weber woke at 0430 hours from a dream he could not remember, only the residue of it clinging to his consciousness like smoke. Something about running through hedgerows. Something about voices calling names he once knew. He dressed in the darkness of his quarters, the routine of military life so ingrained that his hands found buttons and buckles without conscious thought. By 0500 he was at his desk, reading overnight intelligence summaries by lamplight. The news was uniformly catastrophic. Patton's 21 Corps had reached Troyes, 100 miles southeast of Paris. 15th Corps was across the Seine at Mantes and driving toward Reims. The entire German position in France had collapsed from a coherent defensive line into scattered groups of survivors attempting to reach the Siegfried Line before being cut off. The pursuit was no longer a military operation. It was a race. Germans running east, Americans chasing them. The only question was which would reach the German border first. Model had established a new command post near Verdun, attempting to organize rearguard actions, to buy time for survivors to cross into Germany, to salvage something from the wreckage. But his orders increasingly went unanswered. On units that no longer existed could not acknowledge commands. Officers who had been killed or captured could not implement directives. The Wehrmacht in France was not so much retreating as dissolving, like salt in water. Individual crystals separating and disappearing into the chaos. Weber compiled his morning report mechanically. Enemy advance rates, projected crossing points, estimated time until complete evacuation or encirclement. The mathematics were simple and merciless. At current rates, American forces would reach the German border in 7 to 10 days. German forces attempting to retreat on foot, without fuel, under constant air attack, would not make it in time. Perhaps 50,000 men would escape, perhaps fewer. The rest would die or surrender somewhere in eastern France, their sacrifice buying nothing except a few additional days before the war came home to Germany itself. At 700 hours, an aide knocked and entered without waiting for acknowledgement. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he held out a telegram. "Sir, from OKW, marked personal and urgent." Weber took it, already knowing, already feeling the cold certainty settling into his stomach. The telegram was brief, coded, routed through channels that suggested its contents were sensitive enough to require encryption, even within the Wehrmacht's own communication network. Decrypted, it read, "Oberst Hans Weber, you are requested and required to proceed immediately to Army Group B, forward headquarters, current location, Verdun sector. Field Marshal Model requires experienced intelligence officer for assessment of tactical situation regarding encircled elements west of Meuse River. Departure immediate. Transport arranged. Acknowledge receipt." Weber read it twice. The language was careful, requested and required rather than ordered. Assessment of tactical situation rather than rescue operations. The careful bureaucratic phrasing could not disguise what this was. Model needed someone to enter the collapsing pocket west of the Meuse, assess how many men could still be extracted, and coordinate what amounted to a death sentence for everyone who remained. They were sending Weber because he was expendable, because his analysis had been too accurate, his recommendations too defeatist. His value as a staff officer now outweighed by the danger of keeping someone around who spoke uncomfortable truths. This was exile disguised as assignment, possibly execution disguised as duty, or possibly Model actually needed his expertise and was willing to risk a valuable intelligence officer on a critical mission. Weber was too tired to determine which interpretation was correct. Perhaps both were true simultaneously. He acknowledged the telegram, packed a small bag with essentials, and by 900 hours was airborne in a Fieseler Storch reconnaissance aircraft, heading west toward a front that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Below him, France spread out like a map, green and peaceful and utterly indifferent to the armies dying on its soil. Roads choked with refugees. Towns and villages that had changed hands multiple times in 6 weeks. The scars of war visible from altitude. Bomb craters, destroyed bridges, burned vehicles. The pilot, a Luftwaffe lieutenant who looked perhaps 20 years old, flew low and fast, avoiding areas where Allied fighters might be hunting. They landed at a temporary airstrip near Verdun at 1300 hours. A staff car waited, engine running. The driver said nothing, just drove east through countryside that showed increasing evidence of recent combat. Destroyed vehicles pushed to roadsides. Freshly dug graves marked with crude wooden crosses. Columns of disheveled soldiers moving east on foot, their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces empty of everything except exhaustion. Model's headquarters occupied a chateau on a hill overlooking the Meuse, once elegant, now fortified with sandbags and camouflage netting. Weber was escorted immediately to the map room, where Model stood surrounded by staff officers, all of them looking at maps that showed the same story. Blue arrows advancing, red circles contracting, the space between them measured in kilometers that decreased hourly. Model looked up as Weber entered. No preamble, no greeting. "Oberst Weber." "Good, you see the situation?" "Tutsi Corps has elements of 2nd and 9th Panzer Divisions cut off west of the Meuse. Perhaps 8,000 men, perhaps more. Intelligence is fragmentary. Communications are sporadic. They are attempting to reach crossing points at Commercy and Saint-Mihiel, but American forces are already interdicting those routes. I need assessment. Can they break out? Should we attempt relief operations? Or do we write them off and preserve forces for defense of the fatherland? Weber studied the map. The tactical situation was clear enough. The trapped formations were scattered across perhaps 50 square kilometers of territory between the Meuse and American spearheads pushing east. 3 possible crossing points, all under threat. No air cover, minimal fuel, ammunition running low. The men would be exhausted, demoralized, barely cohesive as fighting units. Sir, relief operations would require forces we do not have. Attempting breakthrough from the east would expose those forces to the same encirclement. The only viable option is to provide covering fire from east bank positions while survivors attempt individual or small unit crossing at night. Success rate perhaps 30 to 40%. Casualties in the attempt would be severe. Those who remain behind would almost certainly be killed or captured within 48 hours. Model nodded slowly. That is what I assessed as well. I needed confirmation from someone whose judgment I trust. You will coordinate the covering fire operations. You will also, he paused, his face hardening, personally assess which senior officers west of the river should be ordered to attempt crossing and which should remain with their men. Some names carry more value than others. We cannot save everyone. We can save those whose experience will be most valuable for future operations. The order hung in the air like poison. Weber was being asked to decide who lived and who died, to prioritize officers based on their strategic value, to sentence men to death or captivity while pulling others out based on calculations of future utility. This was triage at the command level. This was the mathematics of catastrophe. Sir, I should note that my son was captured at Coutances. If my judgment is compromised by that experience, your judgment is precisely what I need, Oberst. A man who understands the cost of these decisions, who will not make them lightly, who will prioritize correctly because he knows what it means when we get it wrong. Model's eyes were cold and clear. Your son survived by being captured. Good, he is out. Many men's sons are not out, will not get out. This is war. We do what must be done with the materials available. You have 18 hours to coordinate the operation. Dismissed. Weber saluted and left. In the corridor outside, he stopped and leaned against stone wall that had stood for 2 centuries and would stand for 2 more regardless of who won or lost this particular war. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage, at Model for giving the order, at himself for accepting it, at the entire machinery of military hierarchy that could transform men into resources to be calculated and expended. But rage was useless. Rage changed nothing. He was a soldier. Soldiers followed orders, even orders that required deciding which men lived and which men died based on their future utility to a cause that was already lost. By 1600 hours, Weber had established a forward observation post on the east bank of the Meuse, coordinating with artillery units, reviewing intelligence on American positions, and studying lists of officers trapped west of the river. Major General, Oberst, Lieutenant Colonels, men whose names appeared on organizational charts, whose decisions affected thousands, whose survival might matter if, when, the war came to German soil. He made his list. 12 names. 12 men who would be given explicit orders to attempt crossing tonight. 12 men who would be pulled from their units, sent to designated crossing points, covered by artillery fire while they swam or waded or used improvised rafts to reach the east bank. The rest, hundreds of officers, thousands of enlisted men, would be left behind to fight rearguard actions, to die professionally, to be captured and sent to prisoner camps where they would survive the war and perhaps wonder why their lives had been deemed less valuable than their commanders. Weber knew some of the names on his list, had taught 3 of them at the War Academy, had served with 2 of them in Poland. The other 7 were strangers, known only through service records and personnel files. He was deciding their fates based on rank and specialty and potential future value. like a logistics officer calculating which supplies to save from a burning warehouse. At 1800 hours, radio messages went out to units west of the Meuse, encoded orders to specific officers, crossing points, times, authentication codes. The messages were brief and clear. This was not open to discussion or debate. Orders to be followed. Survival dependent on obedience. By 2000 hours, as dusk settled over the Meuse Valley, artillery units were positioned and ready. Pre-plotted fire missions to suppress American positions near crossing points. Illumination rounds to provide light for artillery observers while keeping the crossing sites themselves in darkness. Medical personnel standing by on the east bank to receive survivors. Boats and rafts assembled from whatever materials could be found. Weber stood in his observation post with binoculars and radio, watching the river, waiting for survivors to appear from the darkened west bank. Around him, artillery crews prepared their guns with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who had done this thousands of times. They did not ask why they were firing, did not question the orders. They aimed, loaded, and waited for coordinates. At 2100 hours, the operation began. American positions near the crossing points erupted under German artillery fire. Not enough guns to suppress all threats, but enough to force American infantry and anti-tank crews to take cover, to hesitate, to give German survivors precious minutes to attempt the crossing. Through his binoculars, Weber saw movement on the west bank, figures running toward the water, some in groups, some alone. They plunged into the river and began swimming or wading, the current carrying them downstream, artillery flashes illuminating them in snapshots of desperate motion. American return fire began almost immediately. Machine guns from positions the German artillery had not located. Mortars walking across the river. The water erupted in geysers. Some figures stopped moving. Some continued. Some reached the east bank and crawled up onto land, collapsing in exhaustion or relief or shock. Medical personnel rushed forward to drag them to safety. Weber watched through binoculars and counted. 1 survivor, 3, 7, a dozen, 2 dozen. The numbers climbed slowly, not fast enough, not nearly enough. The artillery fire was having some effect, but American forces had sufficient positions and firepower to continue interdicting the crossings. For every man who made it across, another disappeared into the dark water or collapsed on the west bank. At 22:30 hours, a radio call came through. Observation Post 1, this is Crossing Site Alpha. We have senior officer identified as Oberst Kraus, 2nd Panzer Division, wounded, requesting medical evacuation. Weber checked his list. Kraus. Yes. One of the 12 names. A man whose expertise in armored operations would be valuable. A man worth saving, according to the mathematics of command triage. Confirmed. Evacuate immediately. Priority transport to field hospital. Another call. Observation Post 1. Crossing Site Bravo. Multiple junior officers requesting permission to cross. They are not on priority list. Instructions? Weber closed his eyes. Men asking permission to save their own lives. Men who had seen the priority list and understood that their names were not on it. Understanding that the artillery cover was limited, that resources were finite, that some men had been designated as worth saving and others had not. Negative on crossing authorization. Hold position. Await further orders. Sir, they are requesting, I said negative, crossing site Bravo. We have limited artillery support. Priority personnel only. Other ranks will attempt crossing when American pressure decreases or will surrender in place. Those are the orders. Silence on the radio. Then, understood, sir. Weber opened his eyes and continued watching the river, continued counting survivors, continued doing the mathematics of catastrophe while men died in water 50 meters away because their names were not on a list that Weber himself had compiled. By midnight, the operation was effectively complete. 47 men had reached the East Bank alive. 12 of them were on the priority list. 35 were not. They had crossed anyway, either in groups with priority personnel or by taking chances when American fire slackened. How many had died in the attempt, Weber could not know. How many remained on the West Bank, Weber could estimate. Thousands. Men who would wake tomorrow to American patrols, who would surrender or fight until overrun, who would spend the rest of the war in prisoner camps wondering why they had been left behind. Weber filed his report to model at 200 hours. Operation successful. Priority personnel recovered. Casualties moderate. Remaining forces west of Meuse estimated as combat ineffective. Recommend termination of relief operations and consolidation of East Bank defenses. Model's response came 30 minutes later. Acknowledged. Well done. Return to Wolf's Lair for reassignment. Well done. 2 words. Professional praise for professional work. Men saved, men abandoned. All done according to doctrine and operational necessity and the brutal mathematics of war that calculated human value in terms of future utility rather than present humanity. Weber did not sleep that night. He sat in his observation post and watched the dark river and the dark western bank where thousands of men waited for dawn and whatever came with it. American tanks, probably, or American infantry. Men who would accept surrender, who would process prisoners, who would send them to camps where they would survive while the men who had crossed the river tonight would continue fighting and dying until Germany itself fell. At 600 hours, American artillery began falling on the West Bank positions. Heavy concentrations, not precision fire, but area bombardment, softening resistance before infantry assaults. Weber watched the explosions through binoculars and calculated casualties he would never see, deaths he would never document, men whose names he would never know dying because someone had to die, and they had been the ones not deemed valuable enough to save. By 900 hours, white flags were appearing on the West Bank. Surrender, the pragmatic choice, the survivable choice, the choice that Weber's son had made at Coutances and that had saved Karl's life. These men would survive too, would become prisoners, would eventually go home when the war ended, would live to be fathers and grandfathers and old men with stories about that time they were trapped west of the Meuse, and the artillery stopped covering their crossing, and they surrendered to Americans who fed them and gave them medical care and treated them like human beings rather than resources to be expended. Weber packed his equipment and returned to the staff car that would take him to the airstrip and back to the Wolf's Lair and to whatever assignment came next. As he drove away from the river, he did not look back, did not need to. The image was already burned into memory. The dark water, the flashes of artillery, the figures struggling across, the ones who made it and the ones who did not. That was August 24th, the day Weber learned that command was not about leading men into battle, but about deciding which men were worth saving when you could not save everyone. The day he understood that professional competence in service of triage was still just organized abandonment dressed in military terminology. By August 27th, he was back at the Wolf's Lair, back at his desk, back to analyzing intelligence summaries that showed Patton approaching the German border. The pursuit was slowing now, not from German resistance but from logistics. Even Patton's aggressive supply system could not sustain advance at the pace of early August. Fuel shortages were forcing operational pauses. Infantry was catching up with armor. The exploitation phase was transitioning into consolidation. But the strategic picture remained unchanged. France was lost. The Wehrmacht had been shattered in the West. The Siegfried Line defenses, neglected during years when all attention focused on the Eastern Front, were unprepared for serious defense. Germany's western border lay exposed. Autumn would bring renewed Allied pressure. Winter might bring them across the Rhine. Weber compiled reports documenting all of this with professional precision. His analysis was clear-eyed and accurate. His recommendations were ignored. The strategic situation had passed beyond the point where intelligence analysis mattered. The war would continue because it had to continue, because surrender was politically impossible, because the machinery of the Third Reich would grind forward until it finally broke, or was broken by external force. On September 1st, exactly 1 month after Patton's Third Army had been activated, Weber received a letter from Karl, forwarded through Red Cross channels, delayed in transit, written in Karl's increasingly steady handwriting. Father, I have been in this camp now for 5 weeks, long enough to establish routine, long enough to begin thinking about what comes after. The Americans and British are kind enough, within the constraints of captivity. We are fed, we are housed, we are put to work on farms or in factories, But the work is honest and no one is worked to death. I have time to read, to think, to remember. I think often about that conversation we had before the bombing, about following the manual, about speed and direction and victory. I followed the manual, Father, exactly as written, and it led me into a crater where I nearly died, and then into captivity where I survived. I am not sure what the lesson is there. Perhaps that manuals are written for ideal circumstances, and war is never ideal. Perhaps that survival requires knowing when to ignore the manual. I spoke with a German professor yesterday, also a prisoner, taught philosophy at Heidelberg before the war. He said something I have been thinking about ever since. The tragedy of Germany is not that we followed bad orders. It is that we were too well trained to question whether the orders were worth following. Father, I do not blame you for the training. The tactics were sound. The doctrine was correct in its technical details. But no one taught us to ask whether the objective was worth the cost. No one taught us to say no when saying yes meant serving evil, even if we served it competently. When this war ends and the other prisoners say it will end soon, that Germany cannot hold much longer, I want to learn something besides warfare. I want to study something besides destruction. I want to build rather than break. I hope you can understand that. I hope you can forgive me for wanting to be something other than a soldier. Your son, Karl. Weber read the letter 3 times, then placed it with the others against his heart. 6 letters now. 6 pieces of his son's transformation from soldier to prisoner to man trying to imagine a future beyond war. 6 reminders that the greatest gift Weber had given Karl was the training that had failed to keep him safe, because that failure had saved his life. September blurred into October. The Allied advance slowed, but did not stop. Market Garden, the British airborne operation in Holland, failed spectacularly, buying Germany time but not hope. Patton's forces bogged down around Metz, struggling against fortifications and weather and logistics. The pursuit was over. The siege was beginning. Weber continued his work with mechanical precision. Reports, analysis, briefings. He was good at it. 23 years of experience made him very good at it, but the work felt hollow now, like he was documenting a conclusion that everyone already knew, but no one was permitted to acknowledge. In November, von Kluge's suicide was officially confirmed. The field marshal had taken cyanide on August 19th, while being transported back to Berlin to face charges related to the July bomb plot. His final letter to Hitler expressed loyalty and despair in equal measure. Weber read the excerpts published in the Wehrmacht Daily Bulletin and recognized his own thoughts reflected in von Kluge's words: professional competence in service of a losing cause, loyalty to an ideal that had been corrupted, the desire to serve honorably in a dishonorable war. December brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, a massive counterattack through Belgium aimed at splitting the Allied armies, reaching Antwerp, forcing a political settlement. Weber analyzed the operational plan and saw echoes of 1940. Breakthrough, exploitation, race to objectives before the enemy could react. The doctrine he had helped write, deployed one final time, supported by resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantity to achieve the ambitious objectives. The offensive achieved tactical surprise. Initial gains were significant. For a few days it seemed possible that German armor might actually reach the Meuse. Then weather cleared. Allied air power intervened. American reserves moved faster than German spearheads. By Christmas, the offensive had stalled. By New Year, it was effectively over. The last mobile reserves of the Wehrmacht had been expended in a final demonstration that doctrine without resources was just theory, that tactics without strategy was just motion, that fighting well without fighting for something worth dying for was just efficient suicide. Weber documented all of it: the initial success, the subsequent failure, the casualties, the equipment losses, the strategic situation, now worse than before the offensive because the last reserves had been consumed with nothing to show for them except a bulge in the Allied lines that would be erased by mid-January. On January 15, 1945, Weber received orders transferring him from the Wolf's Lair to OB West headquarters, now relocated to the Rhineland. The transfer was presented as recognition of his expertise as needing his intelligence analysis closer to the operational front. The reality was that the Wolf's Lair staff was being reduced as the Eastern Front collapsed. Officers were being dispersed. Weber was being sent west because west was where he had specialized, where his knowledge was most applicable, where his analysis of American operations might have marginal utility in the remaining months. He packed his belongings, including the 6 letters from Karl that he kept always against his heart. Before leaving, he walked one final time through the bunkers and corridors of the Wolf's Lair, where he had spent the last terrible months watching Germany's Western armies be destroyed. The maps were still on the walls. The markers still showed positions that no longer mattered. The machinery of command still functioned, issuing orders to divisions that had ceased to exist, planning operations with resources that were long since expended. At OB West, the situation was chaos, barely contained by professional routine. The Allies were across the Rhine in several places. Patton was driving toward Bavaria, British forces pushing into northern Germany. The Americans and British would meet the Soviets somewhere in central Germany. The only question was when, not if. Weber's new assignment was to analyze Allied intentions and recommend defensive priorities. He performed this work with professional competence, knowing that his analysis would be ignored or overtaken by events, but doing it anyway because that was what soldiers did. They followed orders. They performed duties. They maintained standards even when standards no longer mattered, because maintaining standards was all that remained when everything else had collapsed. In March, he received a letter from the International Red Cross. Not from Karl, about Karl. His son had been transferred from England to a camp in the United States, Kansas, somewhere in the American Midwest. The letter included a photograph. Karl, wearing American work clothes, standing in a field with farming equipment. His face was fuller than it had been in Normandy. His expression was peaceful. On the back of the photograph, Karl had written in English, "Learning to plant instead of destroy. Love, Karl." Weber stared at the photograph for a long time. His son, in enemy territory, learning enemy language, working enemy soil. His son, alive and healthy and apparently content. His son, who had survived by failing to follow doctrine, who had been saved by capture, who was now living the future that Weber had failed to imagine, because all he had known how to teach was warfare. The photograph joined the letters against his heart. 7 pieces now. 7 parts of his son's survival. 7 reminders that Weber's life's work, training officers, writing doctrine, perfecting methods of mobile warfare, had been technically brilliant and strategically catastrophic, professionally excellent and morally bankrupt. April 1945. The Americans crossed the Rhine in force. British armies drove into northern Germany. The Soviets surrounded Berlin. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the ruined capital, issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Keitel and Jodl nodded and transmitted commands that no one would follow. The Wehrmacht was dissolving, not retreating, not surrendering en masse, just dissolving like morning fog under the sun, individual soldiers making individual decisions to stop fighting, to go home, to survive the ending rather than die in it. On April 20th, Weber received orders to evacuate OB West headquarters and proceed east toward the Alpine Redoubt, the mythical last-stand fortress that existed more in propaganda than reality. He read the orders, nodded to the courier, and then quietly filed them in his desk drawer and walked out of the headquarters without his uniform jacket, without his insignia, wearing only trousers and shirt like any civilian. He walked west toward American lines, carrying nothing except the letters and photograph against his heart. He walked through countryside that was green with spring growth, past abandoned vehicles and discarded weapons, through villages where white flags hung from windows. He walked for 6 hours before encountering an American patrol. They were young men, these Americans, not much older than Karl. They held weapons but did not point them with particular aggression. One of them spoke German, asked Weber who he was, where he was going. Weber answered honestly, "Officer, Wehrmacht, no longer fighting, seeking surrender." They searched him, found the letters and photograph. The German-speaking American read them, looked at the photograph of Karl in Kansas, looked at Weber's face, and said something to his companions in English. They nodded. One of them handed Weber a canteen. Water, clean and cold. Weber drank, thanked them in English that was broken but comprehensible, and allowed himself to be led back to their company headquarters. Processing was efficient and professional. Name, rank, unit, service history. Weber answered all questions. He was given food, water, a blanket, and assigned to a temporary prisoner compound where hundreds of other German soldiers waited with expressions of relief or exhaustion or shell-shocked emptiness. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. The war was ending. They had survived it. That was enough. On May 7th, word filtered through the camp. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. Total. The war in Europe was over. Men wept. Some with relief. Some with shame. Some with emotions too complicated to name. Weber felt only numbness. It was finished. The cause he had served was dead. The regime he had fought for was destroyed. The doctrine he had written was now just historical footnote about how to lose a war efficiently. In the following weeks, more letters from Karl arrived, now able to pass through official channels without Red Cross mediation. Karl writing from Kansas about American farming, about plans to attend university after repatriation, about wanting to study engineering, building bridges instead of destroying them. Karl writing about forgiveness, about the future, about hoping that his father had survived and would come home so they could learn together what it meant to live without war. Weber was eventually transferred to a larger POW camp in France, then to a work detail helping rebuild damaged infrastructure. German prisoners, under Allied supervision, repairing the roads and bridges in towns that German armies had helped destroy. Weber worked alongside men who had been officers and enlisted men, professionals and conscripts, all of them now just laborers trying to earn their repatriation through physical toil. He was released in December 1946 after 18 months as a prisoner. The journey home to Germany took 2 weeks. Germany was ruins, cities destroyed, industry shattered, millions dead, millions more displaced. The country physically occupied by 4 powers, divided into zones, its future uncertain. Weber made his way to what had been his family home near Munich. The building was damaged but standing. His wife, Greta, had survived. She was thinner, older, but alive. They held each other without words because words could not contain what they had experienced in the years of separation. Karl came home in March 1947, repatriated from America with thousands of other prisoners, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through camps, and finally released. Weber met him at the train station. They stood facing each other for a long moment. Weber saw in his son's face the boy who had left and the man who had returned. Karl saw in his father's face the teacher who had trained him and the broken veteran who had learned too late what his teaching had cost. They embraced. No apologies, no accusations. Just embrace and relief and the overwhelming gratitude of 2 men who had both survived when so many had not. In the years after, they rebuilt. Germany rebuilt. Europe rebuilt. The world moved forward into a new era of confrontation between former allies, of economic recovery, of cultural reckoning with what had happened and why. Weber never wore his uniform again. Never displayed his medals. Never spoke publicly about his service except when required to give testimony at tribunals and denazification proceedings. He did write, though. In his 70s, working from memory and preserved documents, he wrote a history of the 1944 campaign in France from the German perspective. It was published in 1962 under a title that Karl suggested, The Doctrine of Defeat, Mobile Warfare, and the Collapse of the Western Front. The book was brutally honest about German failures, about Hitler's interference in operational decisions, about the obsolete assumption that doctrine written for one war would work in another, about the moral collapse that preceded the military collapse. But it was also honest about American excellence, particularly Patton's operational artistry. The final chapter was titled Lessons from the Student. It began, in the summer of 1944, an American general who believed he had fought in previous lives taught the Wehrmacht its final lesson. That doctrine without adaptation is dogma, that expertise without wisdom is just sophisticated ignorance, and that the fastest way to lose a war is to fight it brilliantly for the wrong cause. The book was translated into English in 1964. An American military historian arranged for Weber to meet some of Patton's former staff officers at a conference in Washington. They were older men now, like Weber, veterans of a war that had defined their generation. They spoke about operations, tactics, logistics, professional soldiers discussing professional problems. One of them, a retired colonel named Harrison, asked Weber the question that had probably been on all their minds. "Did you hate us? During the campaign, I mean, when we were destroying your armies? Did you hate us?" Weber thought about the maps in the wolf's lair, about the Meuse crossing, about Karl's letters, about 23 years of teaching doctrine that had trained men to die efficiently. Finally, he answered, "No, I hated myself for being too competent at serving something that should never have been served. You were just doing what soldiers do, fighting well, following orders, winning. I was doing the same thing on the other side. It took losing to teach me that fighting well is not enough, that soldiers need to ask what they are fighting for, not just how to fight effectively." Harrison nodded slowly. Patton used to say that he had fought in every major war in history. He was crazy, of course, but maybe also right. Maybe all of us, on both sides, were just repeating the same mistakes with better technology, fighting because that is what our generation was taught to do, following doctrine because doctrine was all we knew. They drank coffee and spoke of other things, families, grandchildren, the world that had emerged from the war. Before leaving, Harrison handed Weber a photograph. It showed Patton in his Jeep, somewhere in France, August 1944. The general looking forward with absolute confidence, absolutely certain he was destiny incarnate. "He died in 1945, Harrison said. "Car accident in Germany. Never got to be old. Never had to wonder if it had all been worth it. Maybe he was lucky that way." Weber took the photograph home and placed it on his desk next to Karl's photograph from Kansas. Two images, two men, one who had believed he was reborn for warfare, one who had learned to plant instead of destroy. Two paths forward from the same war. In 1975, Karl organized a trip. Father and son returning to France for the first time since the war. They visited Normandy, where Karl had been wounded and captured. They stood in fields that had been battlefield, now returned to peaceful agriculture. They walked roads that had once been choked with German retreats and American pursuits. They saw monuments to the dead on both sides. At the American cemetery above Omaha Beach, they found Patton's grave. Simple marker, same as all the others, except for the steady stream of visitors. Someone had left flowers. Fresh. Recent. People still remembered. Weber stood before the grave and thought about that terrible August, about maps and markers and the collapse of everything he had thought he understood. Karl stood beside him, leaning slightly on a cane he still needed for the leg injury that had never quite healed. After a long silence, Karl spoke. "Do you forgive yourself yet, Father?" "No." "Should you?" Weber thought about the officers left behind at the Meuse, about all the sons who had followed doctrine into graves while his own son survived by being captured. "I do not know, but I learned the lesson. That should count for something." "What lesson?" "That the fastest tank in the world is worthless if it is racing toward the wrong objective." Weber touched the letters in his jacket pocket. He still carried them 30 years later, still felt their weight. "Your letters taught me that. You and Treschow and everyone who was brave enough to say no when saying yes meant death. You taught me that doctrine without humanity is just murder with footnotes." Karl put his hand on his father's shoulder. "Then maybe you should forgive yourself, not for what happened, but for learning from it, for teaching me to think instead of just obey, for being human enough to be wrong and wise enough to admit it." They stood together in silence as the sun set over the Atlantic. Around them, row after row of white crosses and stars of David marked the price that had been paid for liberation, for victory, for the luxury of standing in peaceful countryside and remembering war. Before leaving, Weber placed something on Patton's grave, a folded piece of paper, the first page of his tactical manual from 1941. The page that read, "Speed is life, direction is victory, initiative is the supreme principle." Under those words he had written in careful script, "But wisdom is knowing what objective is worth racing toward. Without that, speed is just efficient catastrophe. With respect and regret, Oberst Hans Weber, Wehrmacht, 1944." They walked back to their car. The cemetery remained behind them, quiet and peaceful and permanent. A reminder that wars end, but their lessons remain, carved in stone and carried in hearts, passed from generation to generation, in the hope that someday someone will learn them before the dying begins instead of after. Weber lived until 1981. He died quietly in his sleep with Karl beside him. His last words, as spoken in the half-consciousness of morphine and failing systems, were, "Karl, you survived. That is what matters. You survived." And Karl had, and that in the end was the only doctrine that truly mattered. Not speed or direction or initiative, just survival, just the courage to say no when obedience meant death. Just the wisdom to recognize that the greatest victory is sometimes simply living long enough to learn from defeat. The letters remained with Karl after his father's death. 6 pieces of paper, yellowed and fragile, covered in handwriting that had grown shakier as the war progressed. Words from a son to a father. Words about survival and questioning, and the courage to stop being a soldier when being a soldier meant serving evil. Karl kept them until his own death in 2003. Before he died, he donated them to a museum. They are displayed there now, under glass, with a small plaque that reads, "Letters from Lieutenant Karl Weber to his father, Oberst Hans Weber, summer 1944. Written from captivity, carried through a war. Preserved as reminder that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to stop fighting." And beneath that, in smaller text, the final line that Karl had requested, "We wrote the doctrine. They perfected it. We lost. But some of us learned. And learning was the only victory that mattered. The doctrine of defeat, the wisdom of survival. The lesson that came too late for many, but not too late for all. The understanding that professional excellence without moral purpose is just efficient catastrophe." That was what Patton taught the Wehrmacht in 14 days across France. That was what Karl taught Weber through 6 letters from captivity. That was what Weber finally learned in the ruins of everything he had built. That the last professional is not the one who fights best, but the one who knows when to stop fighting and start learning. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, you live long enough to teach that lesson to someone who will remember it, who will carry it forward, who will know that doctrine is just words on paper until wisdom gives it meaning. That is what survives when empires fall and armies dissolve and wars finally end. Not the doctrine, the wisdom to question it,